Welcome back to the Futurist New Deal podcast. We're also recording for the companion piece to the Tranhumanist Handbook. So we're here with Daniel Yeluashvili, and we're going to get a little introduction and synopsis of his chapter in the Tranhumanist Handbook titled Geoengineering, Approaching Climate Change as a Present-Day Preventable Issue. Very important point there. And hey, Daniel, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. So tell us about your chapter. Lay it out for people who are picking up this book.
No problem. Well, my chapter is about climate change and how essentially at present the political conversation on both sides of the political aisle is fundamentally flawed with regards to what to do about climate change and how to discuss it. The core thesis of my paper, of my chapter of the book, is that the only way to prevent climate change is to use carbon sequestration and capture technologies, meaning technologies that would remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store them in pockets underground. Well, the way I see it, that's the only way to prevent climate change. And for those who don't believe that climate change is a genuine phenomenon, I argue that we can agree across the political aisle that developing this technology is important because, number one, it can come from the public sector, the private sector, or both. And number two, there's a bipartisan political precedent in investing in weather modification tools. And whether you want to solve societal issues through government intervention or you believe in limited government and individual responsibility, we can agree that carbon sequestration and capture is important because, number one, according to the Scripps Institute of Oceanography and other similar climate science related institutions, greenhouse gases already exist in the atmosphere at such dense levels that the Earth will not naturally be able to rid itself of them without artificial intervention. Number two, nobody, or rather no institution in society, is geared to amassing grassroots public support to the degree that is required within the next 10 to 15 years to prevent this from happening. Number three, climate change is happening now. It's not an apocalyptic prophecy. It's not a component of any ideology. It's a natural phenomenon. It's occurring as we speak. And in fact, as I write in my paper, by 2050, over 200,000 deaths are slated to occur in direct connection with climate change. So that means that we need to come together across the political aisle, across various demographics. This is something anyone can agree on, from farmer to academic, and invest in carbon capture technologies. We need to fund businesses. We need to contact our representatives in government. We need to vote on the basis of the importance of this issue. So that's what I write about.
Mm-hmm. Very nice, very nice. And an important issue. To say that it is a timely issue is maybe to understate it. It is the timely issue, and the great existential risk of our time. Now, in the 1800s or early 1800s, a gentleman named Samuel Johnson, he wrote a book called The History of Rasselas, and one of the chapters in this book refers to a gentleman who was the scientist of the day in this fictional story, an alchemist, and in this encounter with this prince, that we realize that this alchemist is not a true scientist, but a paranoiac who believes that he has the power to control the weather. A sort of early narrative and insinuating a geoengineering concept. Now, many people, unfortunately and wrongly, when they think of people in our community, transhumanists, they sometimes refer to these paranoid conspiracy narratives. They take this to a bad place. Mm-hmm. What would you say to people who are concerned that geoengineering is playing God, that geoengineering is somewhere on the scale of hubris, something of this kind?
Sure. Well, there's a couple different arguments with regards to skepticism of geoengineering, and I'll address them forthwith. On the left, primarily, people are concerned that geoengineering will not sufficiently reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's not a substitute for existing climate change policies. And to pursue it would be hubristic and arrogant in the way that, for example, the tech giants of Silicon Valley are sometimes perceived this way. And I'm not saying they are, I'm saying that's how people think of them. Well, to that I would say that given the current scientific findings, as I write in my paper, there is a unit of measurement for particles of gases in the atmosphere on the molecular level called parts per million, or ppm. And according to the institution I cited before, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and this is also backed up by NASA, once 400 ppm or more of greenhouse gases is present in the atmosphere, meaning that once out of every million particles of oxygen in the atmosphere, 400 or more of those are carbon dioxide or some other greenhouse gas. This is not reversible. So we can talk all day about moral values, but the Earth is on the line, and all our lives are at stake. So this is not a moral issue. This is an existential issue. On the other hand, those on the right who are skeptical of alarmist causes to incentivize government intervention, I would say that carbon capture does not have to come from the government. In fact, I'm not arguing exclusively for government intervention. I give more specifics in my paper, but put loosely, by 2025, at the very, very least, and more likely it'll take around 10 to 15 years, carbon capture and storage can be developed as a means of exercising individual sovereignty over one's own environment. And this is for the libertarian crowd among us. This is something that's feasible. This is something we can do. We can only do this through subsidization of the private sector, as well as, in the context of the United States, intervention from the public sector. If an exclusively private sector motivated or private sector oriented form of geoengineering is somehow created, I know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a private institution that's working on geoengineering solutions. If that happens without the help of the government, fine. If it's exclusively the government that is able to address these problems, fine. But at present, the way I see it, we need a mix of both. We're short on time, we're short on money, we're short on investment, and frankly, the reason I wrote this is to address a general cultural apathy, or rather a lack of cultural awareness of the severity of climate change. Because the loudest voices in the room either deny that climate change exists, or they want to address it by building a bus, by fighting for zero net emissions public transportation, for example. That's what I see in my hometown of San Francisco very frequently. And that's all well and good. That's, good for you. More power to you. But we need to have pragmatic solutions to world-changing problems. So that's essentially my argument.
Mm-hmm. And and I've noticed that many people on the left who have strong feelings about climate change, they often have a resistance to these particular set of technological interventions. We could say, in a word, they are resistant to the digital. They're insistent upon the analog. They want 20th century solutions to an increasingly 21st century problem, and that resistance to me seems to be particularly kind of technophobic, and so I'm very pleased to see this conversation framed in this way. Now, some moments ago, you mentioned this number, 400 parts per million, being the point at which this is irreversible. For our viewers, give us a little more of a sense of that time frame.
Sure. Well, the number 400 ppm itself comes from 2016. In fact, as Donald Trump was becoming elected to the presidency of the United States, our atmosphere definitively became so polluted with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that at present, well, there's no going back. As the saying goes, we have crossed the Rubicon. And frankly, I mean, I don't know what to say. I'm surprised that people are still focused on partisan disagreement rather than finding ways to come together. And that's because there is, as again I write in my paper, bipartisan appeal from both Democratic and Republican members of Congress to invest in geoengineering and other climate change research. Here's the key. Legislation to this effect has historically been termed weather modification research legislation rather than climate change prevention legislation. And that makes sense because if you walk up to an evangelical Christian, for example, and you start telling them that the world is going to end because of climate change, you're not going to convince them because they believe in the end times.
They already have an apocalyptic worldview.
Yeah, exactly. And that generally goes for anyone with an anthropocentric, meaning human-focused point of view. They're not going to care about collectivistic notions of mutually shared social responsibility. They care about the human being and preserving the human being. So we have to adopt that kind of language in order to reach across the political aisle and get people's attention.
Very nice. So there's a young lady just in the past few days. She's traveled from her home in Europe to across the ocean on a sort of in a boat, a more carbon neutral means of travel. Greta Thunberg is her name. And what do you feel about her kind of messaging? Do you think it advances your approach to solving this problem?
She's raising awareness of the issue, and for that, I commend her. I can only hope that she and people like her focus on practical solutions to the problem rather than falling into ideological traps. Let me give you an example of such an ideological trap.
Please.
There was a research study from Finland by a group of Finnish climate scientists that decried the excess of energy that is being expelled into the atmosphere and the ecosystem at an unsustainable rate, which the study terms exergy, like energy with an X, very clever. And the study openly advocates for what it calls solutions to climate change that are against capitalism. This is a study based on findings from climate scientists advocating for a political worldview. And at that, it's a political worldview that adopts a linear perspective of history. And I have a lot of issues with that, because when one adopts a linear perspective of history, I believe that this has a tendency to absolve people of individual responsibility. Basically, if you believe that history is flowing at an even linear rate, you're not going to be inspired to enact social change here and now. And that's the entire point of my argument. I'm trying to give rise to a sense of urgency among those who care about the future of the Earth. So really, it's good that Greta Thunberg and people like her are bringing awareness to the issue. My concern is that people might go off track with it, and I don't want people to go off track.
Yes, and because, as you mentioned, and it bears repeating, there is no purely analog solution at this point. We've passed the point of no return on this, and so more techno-futurist solutions are required. And speaking of individuals with a somewhat apocalyptic worldview, you were on the Steel Archer program, and you talked about this issue also in the context a little bit of the Amazon fires that are burning.
Yes.
There's strong evidence that corporations neglect is responsible for these fires and specific sets of actions. There's also quite a bit of evidence that President of Brazil, Bolsonaro, a gentleman who may have somewhat of an apocalyptic worldview, was aware of these things and not only did not attempt to prevent them, but fanned the flames, quite literally.
Yes.
What is your interpretation of all of that? How do events like this factor into the larger historicity of trying to address these concerns?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned briefly on Steel Archer's podcast, as you mentioned, not only are these fires a result of neglect, they were actually perpetuated intentionally. There were companies like Burger King, for example, that actively sought to quite literally fan the flames, as you said, of these fires and propagate this damage to the environment, because the way major corporations see it, the trees of the Amazon rainforest are in their way. You see, the space that is left over from trees that are actively bulldozed, burned, and otherwise destroyed through deforestation is used by the agricultural and agribusiness industries. And fast food corporations often utilize this to an unsustainable degree because they're looking for space to graze cattle in order to turn them into beef patties for the hungry masses. And in fact, cattle are a very important point when discussing climate change because they expel methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas that is 4 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So this is really a vicious cycle. And with regards to your mention of Jair Bolsonaro's apocalyptic worldview, it's one sign of many that our political establishment is becoming increasingly out of touch with today's problems. That applies for all sides of the political spectrum. On the right, we have religious people who use their religion to abjure the importance and study of science and technology. And speaking as a religious person who cares deeply about science, I believe that this absolutely does not have to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Left, on the other hand, we have people who want to take America and the world into a new society while relying on 20th century philosophies to do that. A good example, for instance, is the conversation, which is somewhat tangential, albeit related, with regards to automation of jobs and universal basic income versus a federal job guarantee. Now, here's the thing. Jobs are not going to become more plentiful as a result of climate change. If anything, they're going to decrease. Primarily, any job that has to do with farming and agriculture is going to be negatively affected by climate change. In fact, it already is. Africa and South Asia are feeling the brunt of this, as land on which people depend for their income and their food, in many cases, is increasingly becoming less and less arable. So, in order to address this issue, we need to think about where people are going to get their food, how best to preserve food security, and how to reach the maximum amount of people with the greatest sense of urgency with this issue. And the last thing we need is people who rely on 20th century solutions to 21st century problems.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of 21st century solutions and the framing of this, many people in our community, many business leaders who are considered to be a part of this community, they are interested in geoengineering Mars, and this. It seems to me that the cost for doing such a thing is a good deal higher than even the most extensive interventions here on planet Earth. How do you rank those efforts? Give us a little bit of insight into these two things many things really, but these two ideas relative to one another.
Sure. Well, here's the thing. When you compare terraforming Mars to geoengineering here on Earth, the latter is possible within the next decade or so, and that's the mean estimate, provided that we receive sufficient investment and attention. Terraforming Mars is a bit more of a long-term goal. I believe that one does not exclude the other, but that's a purely speculative statement. Because prior to terraforming Mars, we must first travel to Mars and set foot on it as human beings. Although we have the Curiosity rover on Mars, we haven't sent a person up there. So we need to be able to do that first. That's the preliminary step. So when it comes to the feasibility of terraforming Mars, I would say that it's possible in the future, very likely through private investment more so than public, given the current state of NASA's funding from the federal government. But, you know, baby steps.
Very nice, very nice. You mentioned the value of basic income versus other forms, a federal job guarantee. There's many other ways to deal with strengthening the middle class, all manner of policy initiatives and things of this kind. Now, in my Futurist New Deal, one of a number of platforms for the Transhumanist Party, there is a federal land dividend, a basic income scheme, and that involves the use of lands that are already nationalized and held in great number here in the United States, and it involves leasing them to corporations and entities, who would have to then promise to be carbon neutral and promise to maintain certain aesthetic standards and return them as they receive them. Do you think that this kind of thing is feasible? Do you think that it would have a negative impact on the environment? Am I being quixotic in this?
I would say that this is an idea worth supporting. I'm sure you had this in mind, but when you said federal land dividend, I thought of Zoltan Istvan, the founder of the Tranhumanist Party and former candidate for governor in my home state of California. He had a very good idea for a federal land dividend, and I actually asked him, when I met him once, I asked him about the way the federal land dividend would work in the long term. Because when you make money to fund a basic income from leasing land, land is a finite resource. There's only so much of it. Even in a state as large as California, even with so much land available for lease, hypothetically, at some point it's going to run out. And I think that would be, if there were a weakness in this plan, I think that would be a weakness worth considering. Once all the land is leased, the question is, where do you go from there? So that would be my concern.
Yes. And the approximately $173 trillion that we could derive over the course of 10 years from a program of this kind, it would be enough to fund this basic income at $52,000 for every 18 to 63-year-old. But it does. I do sometimes say that this could be regarded as a stopgap program because I do believe, and I think most techno-optimists believe, that we are moving into a world that will be achieving full automation sometime, so that we could maybe expect that this program would only be required for 15 years, be required until such a time that the growing pains of moving into a fully post-industrial society have subsided. What is your assessment of that in terms also of environmental impact? Maybe we're getting into some ideas that are entirely speculative. But what do you think of these prospects of? Is this a libertarian thought experiment to be supposing that this could be a stopgap?
I think it could appeal to people across the political spectrum. With regards to basic incomes and ideas like the federal land dividend, there's a very similar program right now in Alaska which is funded by oil, and that's a deeply Republican state. And on the other end of the extreme, we have countries like Iran, which has a basic income that is essentially state capitalist. It's very authoritarian, it's economically left-leaning, and it's funded by the subsidization, rather not the subsidization, but a government subsidy derived from sales of bread, of all things. And, you know, this raises the question of how we're going to prepare our society for an environmentally catastrophic series of events in the future. But the bottom line, I think, is that we have to do more than we're currently doing. So if this innovation takes into account environmental changes, at this stage, I'm all for it. We don't have a lot of options, and we certainly don't have a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very nice. There's always quite a few concerns in the news cycle about environmental destruction. Are there any areas in which you think that people are being alarmist? Are there any areas in which you would like people to change their messaging with a mind to your primary concern, creating public-private partnerships towards geoengineering?
Yeah, I see a lot of alarmism with regards to the discussion of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Mm-hmm. Now, at present, technology has advanced so extremely that corporations are not only able to engineer new forms of fruit, vegetables, and other food items, but they're also able to patent GMOs. So that, for example, if you're growing corn and you've modified this corn to grow extra quickly or be extra durable, and a corn kernel accidentally lands in another person's field and gives rise to a new, field of corn on somebody else's property, at present, corporations can sue as if they own the idea, and this is how GMOs are treated as intellectual property, per my knowledge. They can sue people for having access to a certain type of corn that they've bred. And I believe that a lot of these corporations behave unethically. But the alarmism starts creeping in when people become inherently afraid of the idea of GMOs. A lot of people are afraid of chemicals and pesticides and, chromosomal changes to certain plant-based organisms. I understand that. The thing about GMOs is that labeling them only adds a stigma to the science. Organisms have been modified by humankind ever since, we started domesticating the first animal or farming the first plant. So it's not unnatural, and it certainly isn't impeding the value of other natural, quote-unquote, organisms. And that's because what we're seeing from the world of GMOs and genetic modification is not new. It's been around for a while. It's no different than anything we've done before, and health side effects are, over time, gradually adaptable. I mean, if we start banning foods on the basis of whether or not they're healthy, we'd have to ban pretty much everything, because everything is unhealthy without moderation. If you eat enough of something, for example, I'm referring specifically to some incidents where people ate genetically modified organisms and they became sick due to aggravated allergic reactions. I can understand wanting to address that medically. The appropriate venue for this problem is to go to your doctor and to ask for medication that's most suitable for your child. And that's going to be different for everybody because people have different bodies and different metabolisms and so on. But you can't just go around advocating for the ban of GMOs. GMOs have been around since man became a farming animal. We can't just pretend they're unnatural.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's an interesting insight because we don't see pushes to be banning commonplace foods that people have allergic reactions to,
Yeah.
and but it's used to that is an interesting insight. Um, uh, well, I think it goes hand in hand. You know what? You and I were looking over the Transhumanist Handbook and saying, let's see what of these chapters relate most directly to engineering concepts, maybe to smart city concepts or civil engineering concepts, and certainly wanting to express some of those ideas to people in the course of these of putting together this companion piece. Can we talk about your vision for other projects of this kind? I know that you have a strong interest in smart cities and urban planning. What other kinds of initiatives for techno-futurists would you like to see happening? Maybe somewhat tangentially related to environmental concerns, of course. All of these things are. But what else? What else is on your wish list?
Sure. Well, I kind of wish I'd addressed it more, but ocean iron fertilization is something I could have written about in my paper, and I can tell you more about it now. There are some ideas with regards to dumping large amounts of iron deposits into the ocean. And the idea is that this would cause a massive algal bloom and a massive plankton bloom. And the thing about algae and plankton is that they're at the bottom of the oceanic food chain. So if their populations rise sporadically and extremely, this could lead to an increase in fish, in various marine animals, and by proxy, an increase in seafood. And not only do we use marine animals for food, a lot of our material resources and material goods come from the ocean. And, you know, if the ocean is unhealthy, humanity is going to be unhealthy too.
It is.
We can't forget that. And in addition to ocean iron fertilization, I would also advocate for something another gubernatorial candidate for California was in favor of, the reintroduction of the grizzly bear into the California ecosystem. And this relates more broadly to various ecosystems around the world, where a lot of apex predators are going extinct because of their value for prize hunting and trophy hunting. If you heard the story of Cecil the lion, the lion that was shot by a dentist, I believe, who enjoyed trophy hunting, which frankly, just saying that out loud, to me, it seems almost absurd. It seems almost surreal that people would want to do this. You know, the optimal solution, I believe, is to reintroduce endangered and extinct animals. And the reintroduction of extinct animals is actually something people are experimenting with through genetic engineering.
Interesting stuff.
A good example of that is the cultivation of a living, breathing, partial elephant-mammoth hybrid that was attempted a while back.
By a few different universities, yes.
Sorry?
A few different initiatives and universities in Japan and China attempting to do this over the years.
Yeah. If we could see more of that and more attempts to reintroduce endangered animals into their native ecosystems, I think that would be ideal.
Yes. So we mentioned the health of the oceans, and the health of the oceans at present is not optimal. And it's also a concern, maybe a little bit like many concerns in this area, where a lot of people tend to have the attitude of out of sight, out of mind. And we could talk. You mentioned one approach to bioremediation. There's other approaches to bioremediation with respect to the health of the oceans. What of these come to mind as being most valuable? And are there any scenarios where you see concerns of accidentally doing something really bad, some kind of gray goo type scenarios.
Yeah. Well, as I said, ocean iron fertilization as a form of geoengineering is something of which I'm an avid proponent. I would also suggest that everyone listening to this check out the Seafood Watch program. It comes from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is not only an aquarium, but an active hub for research and development of various forms of marine life conservation and oceanic environmental conservation. They have an app that you can download on your phone called Seafood Watch. And Seafood Watch will tell you which aquatic organisms, which seafood is environmentally friendly in its consumption and which seafood is environmentally unfriendly. So that when buying seafood for yourself or for somebody else, if you're catering an event, for example, if you're just looking for something to eat, you can double check to see what kind of practice you're supporting. I'll give you an example of the negative. Eels, especially in sushi, unagi, one of my favorite types of sushi.
Yeah, very delicious. Mine too.
It's really good. Apparently, freshwater eels are farmed in such a way that when they're raised, they actually have various forms of fertilizer and various forms of waste that accumulates in the water in which they live. And all this waste is flushed out into the ocean. And once it gets in the ocean, it negatively affects the fish because their organisms don't know how to react to that appropriately. A lot of fish get sick and die, and that negatively affects the ecosystem of the ocean near these farms. So it's these kinds of situations that arise when people don't know what kind of seafood they're eating. And I think if people are more informed, they will collectively be able to make better decisions with regards to the food they consume and the kinds of practices they support.
Mm-hmm. So the focus of your chapter and the focus of this discussion is on the most preventable, the most proactive kind of solutions. We alluded to this earlier in this discussion. Changing the factory farming. There's a lot of options today. There's just in the valuation of these companies, the Beyond Beef and those have spiked. We mentioned Burger King and also McDonald's as bad actors in this Amazon fire set of concerns. But Burger King has also released a faux meat product that is quite popular, and a faux meat Whopper. People are really enjoying this. Do you see lab-grown meats or faux meats as being a good solution to the ecological damage caused by factory farming? How do you see people embracing this and messaging along these lines?
Definitely. I think lab-grown meat and ideas like the quote-unquote impossible burger are the future of a sustainable Earth. If we care about climate change, this is definitely something we have to push for. Not only does it address the problem of farmland becoming increasingly less and less arable, but it's also environmentally friendly in the sense that, with regards to the problem of cows and methane that I mentioned earlier, you don't have to grow more live animals to produce this kind of quote-unquote meat. In fact, I'll give you an anecdote. I have a friend who's vegan, and she's told me repeatedly that if I care so deeply about the environment, I should go vegan because a lot of what's called carbon footprints, basically the impact that people have on the environment negatively through their day-to-day routine, a lot of that comes from the consumption of meat, specifically of beef. And if people cut that out of their diets, then their lifestyles would be a lot more sustainable on the environmental level. And that's true. But so far, the average American has not abjured meat. To the contrary, people love it. People love their steak. People love their burgers. I count myself among those people. It's a bad habit, but I do it anyway. And I think if we see more of this lab-grown meat on the market, not only does that address the problem of a sustainable diet, but a sustainable environment as well. So I think this is a good thing. It's a thing to push for. I see a lot of pushback potentially from farmers, but if initiatives for lab-grown meat come from the same sources as initiatives, for example, for geoengineering and carbon capture, farmers are going to get on board. They don't like what's happening. They don't like the status quo. In fact, a number of farmers who supported the Trump administration are now renouncing their support for him because they don't like what's happening to the land that they use to cultivate their produce. It's possible to build a coalition with farmers and potential opponents of lab grown meat in order to get them to embrace it. And that's something I really support.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Yes, there's a very real sense in which, when talking about fossil fuels, the special interests really run the table in terms of creating policy, and that's true to a high degree with this set of special interests as well. There's every sense in which these particular industries are propped up by regulatory frameworks, whereas they would not be economically feasible otherwise in many areas. You mentioned this concern about methane and about the impact of factory farming. There's every indication. So this is basically, after this large constellation of fossil fuel concerns, this is basically the second biggest existential risk around climate change is factory farming. The impact on the environment, on the air that we breathe, and the water that we need is enormous. And there is also these not entirely parallel trajectories where the developing world may be tending to move leapfrog these special interests that we have in the United States and move into greener technologies as a matter of course. But these consumer tastes are such that they would tend to want more and more meat than they've ever had. And so we see this one area of risk probably tending to diminish. That's what projections tend to say. Another area of risk tending to escalate unless we have these faux meat alternatives becoming more central to the marketplace. Are there any other market factors that you see affecting the viability, the carbon of having a sustainable society and a sustainable carbon footprint?
Definitely. Meat, like we were saying, is a big one. The production of meat at present is unsustainable, and the corn lobby is also in many ways very much like a metastasizing, almost, I wanted to call it a tumor, but that's perhaps in poor taste. It's an uncontrollable force in American politics, and I really hope that its influence becomes restrained, because the diet of the average American at present has simply too much high fructose corn syrup, too much sugar, too much processed sugar. That's the thing. It's important to focus one's diet around the consumption of unprocessed ingredients and products. And in fact, this might seem random, but it's heavily related. The influence of certain religious institutions on politics. We were mentioning earlier the influence of apocalyptic worldviews on our society. I believe that they don't have to be explicitly fought against, but there are people in this country and, in fact, around the globe who believe, due to the way they were raised, that everything is beyond their control and hurtling towards an end of time, an end of history that is out of their hands. This engenders in people a feeling of helplessness. And what's important is to communicate with with people who believe this, with various religious institutions and various philosophically oriented organizations, we need to communicate that individual responsibility is important and caring about one's community is important. And no matter how you see the world, no matter what your worldview is, no matter where you think the world is going, we can agree that people caring about the resources they invest in and consume is important, because it is. I mean, at present, the Earth is our only home. We were talking about terraforming Mars, that's decades away at least.
Mm-hmm.
We have nowhere else to go. So we might as well take care of what we've got.
Mm-hmm. And I touched upon this idea of some socially conservative institutions. And, I think of someone like Stephen Bannon, who's been incredibly influential on the world stage. And a fair part of what he's done is driven by by his relationship to social conservatism and faith. Almost, in a certain light, he almost seems like a character from the Dan Brown popular fiction stories, the Da Vinci, some shadowy figure from the Da Vinci Code or something.
Yeah.
These things are not this idea of being responsible stewards of our planet and embracing our cultural traditions and faith. These things are not diametrically opposed, and it's very easy, as you said yourself, to imagine a world where people are using their faith in as in a positive way in this area. Do you see other areas in which social mores are an impediment or are a big factor in dealing with existential risks, particularly around care for the earth?
Definitely. I think we haven't done enough outreach, and by we, I mean people who care about the future of the environment. We haven't done enough outreach to people with an anthropocentric worldview. And a big part of that is what's called the tragedy of the commons. And this is something I talk about in my paper as well. The tragedy of the commons is a term with two meanings. The first comes from the 19th century, from a man named William Forster Lloyd. He was an economist who believed that in an agricultural environment, in an agri-commune, which in those days were a lot more common than they are today, when you have a group of people with shared resources, individual self-interest will cause the natural degradation of such a society. Because instead of sharing resources that are available to multiple people to take, rather than being redistributed by a higher government or party, these resources would be called rivalrous goods. That's the economic term for it, where people have resources and they can take them for themselves. That kind of model becomes unsustainable due to individualism and focus on oneself. Now, the more modern use of the term tragedy of the commons, and the one I use in my paper, comes from 1968, from ecologist who's also been cited in economics, Garrett Hardin. And Garrett Hardin writes that this idea that I just described doesn't only apply to agricultural societies. It applies to the entire planet, which can universally be envisioned as one big agri-commune. And Hardin writes that, well, essentially, people have a lot of self-interest and a lot of focus on individualism. And that naturally leads to a lack of commonly agreed upon solutions to problems that affect the entire planet. And it's precisely to address this problem that I raise the point of geoengineering. This is an idea that can be conveyed to anyone from, the progressive activist to the conservative pastor. This is a universal principle because it's flexible, it's malleable, and when it comes to socially conservative norms and principles, we have to realize that we live in a polarizing time, and in order to transcend political polarization, we need to adapt our language and our moral foundation to reason with each other in a more effective way.
Very nice, very nice. And so I think a critical point of your writing on this subject is to criticize people from across different sides of the issue and different sides of the aisle on maybe not always their messaging, but on their approaches to these issues. Yeah. I would encourage people to pick up this book and read your chapter if they want to better understand maybe the areas in which the Green New Deal is a little bit weak. But let's talk about this for a moment. By way of moving towards a conclusion, what does the Daniel Green New Deal look like? Let's lay out the bullet points of your green initiatives.
Sure. Well, number one, as I said, is investment, both from the public and private sectors, in carbon sequestration and carbon capture. Now, here's the thing. At present, technology exists in China to siphon carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transform it into solid carbon. This can be used to form blocks, in fact, which theoretically can be used in construction for buildings, even for residential spaces. And I think that would be really revolutionary if we could use carbon sequestration technology to capture carbon dioxide, use it to make blocks of carbon, and use that in construction projects. We invest in that from the public sector and the private sector as well, much in the same way that certain corporations are cooperating at present with the federal government. I'm reminded, for example, of the relationship between the Obama administration and General Motors. And beyond this, we need to establish a bipartisan consensus that carbon capture is important, both from the Democratic and Republican parties. Of course, they can disagree on the language that they use and the eventual goals they have for society, but we have to realize that neither of our two major parties are going away. Historically, our government has always flipped from left-leaning to right-leaning and back again, and that's not going to change. Beyond that, we need to focus on reintroducing endangered and extinct animals back into the ecosystems of our planet, and especially focus on the well-being of our oceans. We need to focus on the health of the ecosystem in the global, conglomerate of oceans, and we need to heavily monitor and research the well-being of the flora and fauna that reside in the oceans. Mm-hmm. Now, beyond that, lastly, I would also recommend investing in, as you were saying, lab-grown meats. If we have lab-grown meats available freely and affordably to the consumer, we will be more effectively able to transcend the problem of unsustainable agriculture and agribusiness.
Mm-hmm. Very nice, very nice. This Chinese initiative to be packing this carbon waste into a small and usable byproduct. It brought to mind also something that I read of recently, which is, in a word, an ice cube maker for the oceans, rebuilding the Arctic ice through mechanical means. What do you have you heard of this? Is this something that's feasible in the near term?
This is new to me, but I like the idea. I think in order to test these possible technological and techno-optimistic solutions, we need further testing, because it's never good to rush into things without prior testing and experimentation. But that's a good idea. I think it's worth investing in, and I'd be happy to look into it and research it more.
Yes, I do need to read up on that one a little bit more as well. That's something that's probably a little bit more speculative than the prototype that you mentioned. But I thought it might pique some folks' interests. Well, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to have spoken with you again, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this. And really a wonderful chapter. And a very serious-minded, and your talk also last weekend a delightful a breath of fresh air at this event. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that an awful lot. Thank you for what you're doing. You're adding a lot to this conversation around climate change, and we do need to be far more proactive, far more focused on these 21st century solutions, and because we can't just put a Band-Aid on these things anymore. As we mentioned a few times in this talk, we've moved beyond the point of no return, and we have to go for bigger solutions.
Definitely. And thank you so much for having me. It's always great to talk to you, and thank you for the kind words. I hope that people are able to pick up on this message and spread it as fast as possible.
Yes. Time is of the essence.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. All right. Thank you, sir. We'll talk soon.